The Jetsons Charlton Issue 3. George complains about all the bills. It's annoying that George calls the market a space market when it's not in space. Elroy tells George to duck, and George turns his head and avoids the flying toy while somehow not wondering why he said duck and trying to find out what he said it about. I always hate when a character has selective hearing because it pulls me out of it. He says the family is going to save money from now on. It's satisfying that he gets to call out Jane on something. Usually she gets away with everything. She calls him dear and darling and says she'll send the dress back. He forbids his daughter from making interplanetary calls and doesn't let someone finish her sentence, and a silly looking hat floats and lands on George's head. And somehow Elroy compliments it, so he must just be buttering him up. It turns out the hat is his. Rosie really has no excuse for calling George a name when he's got every right to try to save money if he's upset about the bills. So at least he gets Rin to insult her, even if the writer tries too hard to make it look like he went too far. His family would call him out on talking like this because it'd be seen as bigoted against robots. He gets disappointed by the food because Rosie was given a tiny budget for it. I have to assume George never saw the picket signs. The only thing he told Elroy to cut back on was gum, and he never did anything to Astro, so they're being melodramatic. Jane tells George that she sent a package of golf clubs back because she knows he already had some. He's devastated and plans to feel better by driving to the moon and back, even though you'd think someone trying to save money would want to save on gas. He's mad that Judy was playing the stereo in his car because she wasn't allowed to run up the electric bill with the visiphone. He gets mad about this, even though he's planning on wasting the gas in the car himself. I don't like the message of the story. George tells Astro to get inside for panhandling because he's embarrassing him, even though he should appreciate money. And then Jane tells him the family's gonna leave him to stop being a burden on him. Elroy cries as if this isn't just a trick to get him to change his mind. That doesn't make as much sense. It comes out of nowhere, so would have made more sense if it was just trying to manipulate him. He gives up, and thank goodness, Jane says she didn't really send his new golf clubs back. In the next story, which has its title implied that it's going to be a total cliche of the series, Rosie gets told off for the floor being messy and says she can't bend over because she chipped a gear, somehow. I hate that George says, "Let me alone." George is still annoyed, naturally because he's paying this woman and the floor is still messy. It's not like he's reacting this way to his wife. Surprisingly, Rosie decides to abandon the family just because of him, as if she doesn't care about the rest of them at all. So that's out of character. He correctly points out that she was too expensive an appliance. His family all tells him to get supper for them, miraculously all saying the same exact sentence without rehearsal. Too many panels are wasted on him using the Food-O-Matic before a predictable conclusion where he presses the wrong buttons, which has absolutely no excuse for happening because they'd be labeled, and he only hired Rosie recently. So you'd think he'd still remember how to use this from a lifetime of experience. Not to mention there's no way a live chicken would be sent out of it. Why would anything be sent flying out of it? How would that be possible? Jane smiles at this sadistically. George ends up breaking stuff after cleaning the house, somehow, because he's clumsy. He wouldn't have worn a pink apron. He gets knocked over by Rosie right after he was demonized for being clumsy. She can't help it, but neither can he. Rosie really must have done this to him on purpose if she's not doing all of that. George apologizes, and she agrees to come back to work. George really didn't have to clean the floor. It turns out he literally didn't have to do that because Rosie can bend over just fine now. So at least him doing that was justified because he thought she couldn't. In the next story, George says his dinner isn't seasoned right and wonders if their electronic chef is out of order again, because this is another universe where they have one. I hate that Jane says there's nothing wrong with dinner, like she's telling him he's not actually tasting what he thinks he is. Then she expects me to believe that he can't fix anything right, even though he can fix his car and fix the Food-O-Matic successfully most of the time in other comments. I don't understand why the writer set this in a universe where he's not even good at the one thing he's a genius at. So a bunch of panels are wasted before he's told that he messed up the Food-O-Matic, making it serve the wrong things. So she abusively tells him to eat banana skins, strawberry jam, and potatoes with chocolate syrup. That sucked. Why doesn't a character we hate go through this kind of writer abuse? Like Judy. Then George insults Rosie for telling him to buy worthless stock. Jane has some condescending dialogue that she's smart even if she is a robot. And you'd think people wouldn't talk like that in the future right in front of robots. George sees on the news that the stock she recommended him yesterday tripled in value. Already the story's over. I wish the comic did a better job making it obvious what's a comedy page and what's a story, because that was underwhelming. But it would have just led to an empty, predictable story where he bought stocks and lost money on them. In the next story, a traffic cop tells Judy to pull over near George's house. She flatters him, and she really didn't have to tell him that George taught her how to drive. What made her think that was a good idea? Normally people get taught to drive by driving school. So if George taught her how to drive, that means she doesn't have a license because she didn't go to driving school. Unless she means that he taught her how to drive and then she went to driving school. He can't be assuming that she never went to driving school and got a license, or he'd be arresting her for not having a license. She smiles when the traffic cop blames George and asks to see his driver's license. So she must have known he'd miraculously act this way instead of simply punishing her. You'd think he'd punish her. George gets given a summons for improperly instructing a minor, even though there's no proof that he taught her wrong. And in fact, it's not like he's getting pulled over all the time, so clearly she's just bad at driving regardless of being taught well. She apologizes to George and makes a lame excuse for what she did when she didn't have to tell the cop who taught her how to drive. It's not like traffic cops go look for the person who taught someone how to drive and arrest them every time. They don't assume the driving school messed up. Then some twad does something to improve George's car for fun, calling Earthlings technologically inferior, when in earlier comics Martians were that way. It's not the best idea to have him be both a child prodigy at technology and a warlock at the same time, like it wasn't unbelievable before. And he should know that making his car too fast will get George a ticket. He just doesn't care. And again, he did kick him in his first ever appearance, so it does make sense that he would hate George. I wish he got kicked by him before he did this. He turns invisible because George is coming up to him, and George's car speeds away, causing the traffic cop to tell George to go to headquarters with him. Obviously, George and them would hear Elroy talking to some and blaming himself, and turn to face them wondering why he said that. Elroy should have had a dotted, whispering text bubble. Some messes with the traffic cop's engine to make his car take off. He'd still remember to go harass George. Or maybe the idea is he changed his mind because he thinks George was just having car trouble because he did. The story ends with Elroy telling some that George didn't get a ticket, but he needs his car back to normal. I guess he's still friends with some because he thinks he's amazing, and maybe he has problems with George. In the next story, Judy wonders if her dad would hate her new boyfriend for being a hippie. Jane gets an idea and gives him a wig, silly glasses, and a fringed jacket of hers that she had no reason to have. I guess they're from a costume party. I get why she's doing this. It's to make the normal him look better. Jane tells Judy to introduce Normie by a different name. George is mean to him. Jane tells him to remove his disguise, and George likes him and shakes his hand. But sadly, the story ends with Judy wanting to find a boy who looked like the exaggerated hippie Jane dressed him as. So this was all for nothing, undercutting the happy ending. The Jetsons Charlton Issue 4. Jane already foreshadows that George made a mistake by parking on a certain part of the terraformed Venus Park because she complains about it. And there's no parking sign, and no trespassing sign. I hate idiot plots. He makes a convincing excuse that he wants to see the real Venus, but they could see it from the air by flying above it, so he should know this wouldn't be worth getting a ticket for parking here and risking their lives. He's got no reason to think there won't be a bull on the other side of the fence and go over it. He gets poked by a bull, which must have been slowed down significantly for no reason to do so little damage to him. Maybe it was genetically engineered to be that way to humans. Natsu gets bitten by a tree branch. Then Jane thinks the lake is too good to be true as well because she's always right. At least spread it out among the family members. Rosie uses an axe they must have kept in their car that was kept just off screen until now, cutting down a tree to make a huge club for the ants, probably in case they're giant. George should know better than to threaten to have her reprogrammed. This is an exaggeration of how he treats her. Elroy gets a bite fishing, and George helps and fishes up a big monster, but in the next panel it's gone with no explanation. So I have to assume it got eaten by the flying pigeon. Why does it call it a pigeon when it doesn't look like one? Rosie really did research Venus before coming here because she already knows they have sharp teeth without seeing them and scares one away with the club. Why is there wildlife like this here anyways? I have to assume Earthlings and other planets as aliens put their excess wildlife here for storage so it wouldn't go extinct. And of course he ends up threatened by giant ants. Since they took so long to show up, by now I'm just thinking that it was too predictable that they did when they could have easily not because she was clubbing other things. The story ends with them leaving the planet. In the next story, Judy fawns over a rock star hippie called Sirius while her parents don't approve. This better be different enough from the Moon Duster story because it's the same thing. She somehow expects him to show up after inviting him there for dinner even though he's a busy celebrity. It's good of Jane to say he might be very nice in person. She's a great character when she's not talking to George. Judy reveals as she's driving over to him that she's the only member of his fan club. Which doesn't make sense because she saw him on television. Unless she means this is the only fan club he's got in this city. But she talks like this is the only fan club there is. He tells her at the studio that his agent does all of the writing and reading as he speaks in ridiculous English, saying y'all for one person somehow. He agrees to go home with her because it's fiction, and somehow reveals that he shaved once when he was 7. He really should have been an alien. No one in the family can stand his aftershave, and even Rosie got rust spots from it. Elroy thinks to keep Ansel from biting him, even if it's because he thinks he'll catch something. Judy's so selfish that she tells Sirius he should be their guest, despite the obvious reactions of her family. Somehow Rosie sneezes. For a second time it's lampshaded that Judy should be reacting the same way as everyone else to him. Sadly, this doesn't lead to a proper explanation for why she's immune, and instead he gets sneezed and itch powder and sprays her. He ends up running out of the house towards a taxi that was somehow right there. As if he was smart enough to call it and tell it to wait outside the house for an instant pickup, because he thought there's a chance she might be a crazy fangirl. It turns out Elroy got serious with the powder. Rosie's response would cause Judy to realize someone in her family had a plan to do something about Sirius and get mad. In the next story, some little thin line of paper comes out of the giant computer in George's office, telling him that they're canceling his orders. He thinks the computer went crazy and doesn't get believed, and thinks George didn't fill out the order forms right. I hate his yellow outfit. He fires George, making it the first time George was fired for a significant part of a plot in a comic. And I'm impressed it took so long. I guess George will prove the machine made a mistake. He sits on the park bench as someone's feeding the birds, and he wonders what's wrong and gets told. He says he knows a way to make any computer go crazy and shows him the master computer that controls every computer all over the world, which would never exist because that's ripe with abuse potential. All it takes is one person to screw things up, and even says he's the most powerful man in the world. It sure is a convenient coincidence that George met him, but if a coincidence is all that's wrong with the story, that's a pretty good story. As long as it's not 24 coincidences. George thinks his assistants look suspicious. He'd only think that if he heard one of them say they've got to get away, because otherwise he would only be judging them on their looks, when he's no looker either. He should have said this because they were already running away. He gets told they're saboteurs, and I hope it's explained why they were doing what they were doing. If the computers in society go wrong, that'll bother them too. George drives after their spacecraft, because in this universe, that's what the cars are called. Conveniently, the guy with him has an Inviso ray to use on him and George. The saboteurs tell Mr. Cogswell that they won't be able to cause Spacely's computer to make mistakes from now on and plan to resign. They already know they're screwed just because George followed him here. They'd be heard talking and reacted to, but somehow they aren't. I wish they had whispering text bubbles instead. This makes the first appearance of Mr. Cogswell in a comic, and it's odd that it took so long, but it's a sign of how creative they were. The two criminals end up holding on to each other without being able to pull apart because of the micro-magneto ray, which the blonde also had with him. It's annoying that Jane calls George Daddy. The blonde tells George that he found the circuit the saboteurs used to ruin Spacely's computer and that he fixed it. He gets thanked, stiltedly calls him friend instead of his name, and Spacely miraculously let George come back and do more orders. He wants to hire that man to put their competitors out of business, but out of nowhere, the idiot reveals he destroyed his machines with a molecular disintegrator because George convinced him they were dangerous machines. He shouldn't have been written a call at that because they're not disintegrated. He says it'd take too long to put them back together, and he's through. The last page is a waste of time, but at least I get to see Elroy having fun skating. Why did that ending have to be so depressing? In the next story, I wonder if George won't be on time tomorrow because he tells his boss he will be at the start. You'd think he could easily get to his office at 9 o'clock. He tells his family he's going to get promoted when I bet he won't, or he'll hate it. He tells Jane she should call a programmer because Rosie's made them the same meal twice this week and he thinks he's better than that. Rosie apologizes for making a mistake and Jane forgives her and says they've already had their dinner, and George tells her he's got a problem with it. Since she's never on his side, Jane tells him to apologize, and he refuses because he wasn't lying. He didn't have to be rude to Rosie, but he probably has a good point that they should get her to stop making the same meal twice in 1 week, if they can afford it. Assuming it won't be too expensive to get the programmer to do that. Why does he consider getting the programmer for that instead of simply asking her not to do that? She said she made a mistake, so clearly he does need the programmer because she's glitching up. Since otherwise she couldn't do that by accident. Someone tells Spacely he just finished the magnetic gear wheels, which Spacely knows how to keep secret. He tells his employees he appointed their top salesman George vice president of their new products. And they all look concerned, which means they have to know he's an idiot. Then I'd really like an explanation for why he was promoted. George says to a microphone that he'll start shipment of their new products. Spacely tells someone his plan is in operation because George is telling everyone that he knows all about their new products. And for some reason they think their rivals will be caught off guard. George doesn't like that he doesn't even know what the products are, so I wonder if he'll find out. Someone at a rival company's office plans to find out what the new products are by stalking George. He should have been written as a private investigator, because only that way would he be able to do this without getting arrested. You'd think George would eventually notice that there's always the same car following behind him from his rearview mirror. How does it make sense that we can never see the rearview mirrors in these cars? After days, he's told by Mr. Cogswell to go over George's private papers. It's exciting that Cogswell is being used finally. The guy gets into a mecha from behind to get disguised as a maintenance robot so that it can get Rosie thinking that he's here to check out his electronics. She thinks he's handsome, which seems vain because he's just an orange herd. I guess George won't tell him to leave because he's scared of getting hurt by a robot. After a pinup where George gets bit by a Venus flytrap, when he had no excuse for ignoring the sign about it, George distracting Rosie by giving her an order gives the bad guy the time to steal George's briefcase without being seen. Rosie's got the clarity to assume he stole it despite thinking it's good looking, so that's a relief. There's no excuse for her having a built-in radar tuned into his frequency, whatever that means. It should have been explained that Elroy gave that to her for fun, because he's a child prodigy in the show. Someone tells Spacely that George isn't at work yet, and he makes a surprisingly funny joke. Maybe we got lucky and our competition kidnapped our new vice president. I don't see how they missed that kidnapped was spelled wrong, but it's good that he has a nervous smile instead. He plans to start shipping his new products to other planets now that his competitors are off guard. Why would they be off guard when they're expecting him to have new products? I don't understand Spacely's plan. The inventor of the new invention gets complimented for it, and George lands his car near a warehouse for rent. He tells Rosie to stop making that noise because apparently she has control over it. Why is she able to make that noise? The bad guys say these are just ordinary gear wheels that fooled them. I don't understand it either. George has no reason to think this robot doesn't have any mechanisms when he's in front of it. Not behind it where its panel is open. I have to assume he says this after looking in the back panel and finding nothing. As I wonder how that guy fit in there, he decides to spy on the people talking by crawling through the air duct, which would be noisy in real life. He could have eavesdropped on them by simply standing behind them. One of them thinks they don't have any new stuff and are selling the same gears under a new label. George ends up telling Spacely he went too far just because of that, when he shouldn't be sympathizing with someone who stalked him, broke into his house, and stole from him. Spacely says in a good mood that he had to do that to get the contract signed. He doubles George's salary, and I wonder if it's not gonna last because it's not the end of the story. Of course it doesn't. Someone tells him he's gonna sue him because the new gears are no good, which makes no sense because surely the inventor would have known all about and tested them first. He tears the contract, Spacely gets back at the half-wit inventor, and Cogswell says George is a genius because he almost put him out of business. And I have to assume that's why George still keeps his job and is happy at the end of the story. I guess Cogswell stole the terrible new product's design and almost got put out of business because of it. But that must have been off screen because all I saw was his goons thinking that the old gears were the new product. The first story is about George telling his family to start saving money just for him to be made miserable because he gets given awful food and isn't allowed to have a package he ordered that must have had dues to pay at the door. And when his family tries to leave him out of nowhere after barely any time, he gives up. This was a depressing story. While he was a hypocrite for complaining about people restricting his spending and stuff, he shouldn't have been portrayed as the bad guy. The story never did anything to tell me he does have plenty of money to the point where he overreacted. And at no point was sci-fi technology actually needed in this plot. Then there's a story where George just being mad at Rosie for being unable to clean the floor caused her to quit, as if she suddenly stopped caring about the family. She is too expensive because she constantly needs repairs, so it would have been a better financial investment to just buy a new maid. But the story wants to punish him for doing something the family doesn't approve of. So it shows him possibly unable to use the food-o-matic and clean the house without breaking anything. I know he looks like the bad guy by acting like he didn't care about Rosie's back problem, but he was paying her to clean his house. So he had every right to be frustrated that she wasn't. And if he even did not care about her, it's not like he could help not caring. So he didn't deserve a story of punishment where it acted like he fired her and was getting karma for it. Combine that with her quitting way too easily when she could have easily not, so she's the bad guy but never gets called out. And it's the second story in a row with informed wrongness, one of the top two easiest tropes to ruin a story with. It was interesting to see how George suffered, so it's okay to go through. But this didn't require sci-fi technology either, when even the food-o-matic scene could have been replaced with him sucking at cooking. Then there's a story where because Rosie doesn't exist, the improper seasoning of the food causes George to mess up the food-o-matic because this is set in a universe where he can't even fix things right, as Jane outright confirms. Why get all the canon wrong just to make him miserable? I wish he said that sometimes he fixes it right. Because then I could have accepted it because he has messed up fixing it before in the 60s comic. The next story has some make George's car too fast when he wouldn't know he'd get a ticket for it, and he could have easily not done that. So I wish George was written to be mean to him first. But at least he saves him from getting a ticket. But only because he directs his lack of empathy of the traffic cop next. This is a much better way to handle the character, even if it's unacceptable that George and the traffic cop didn't react to Elroy talking to him. Then there's a story with Jane disguising Judy's new boyfriend as an even more exaggerated hippie so that when he removes the disguise, George will like him. And while it's satisfying to see her plan work, the ending makes it all pointless because Judy loses interest in him for not looking like the disguise. Because she doesn't have good taste. It's another story relying on changing the rules of the series because she never showed interest in hippies until this one. And all because it was written in the 70s. This story didn't use sci-fi technology, but it was the only good one. The first story is about George insisting on picnicking on the dangerous part of terraformed Venus, even though there's a no parking sign, and the Tourist Bureau advised against it. Because he wants to see the real Venus, which falls apart as an excuse when he could just fly over the area to see it in safety. But because he needs to be told what's wrong with the wildlife and is surprised by it, it's just his ignorance making him disregard the sign. But still, he wouldn't have come here because he could have gotten a ticket for parking here. But at least it was an interesting enough story to be worth it, even if it was too uncreative how the aliens were. The second story is about Judy inviting a hippie rock star home for dinner that everyone else at home hates because she's selfish, and somehow he agrees despite being a celebrity. And nobody can stand his aftershave but her. But the lazy writer doesn't remember to explain it despite lampshading it twice, and Elroy sprays him with sneeze and itch powder to get him to leave. I don't like getting yet another story demonizing hippies. We got it the first time, and this had nothing to do with sci-fi. The third story has George get fired because his work computer cancels all of his orders thanks to a virus put in it by people, which he only finds out because he miraculously met the owner of the impossible master computer and saw them, and followed them in his car. Spacely has no reason to take George's word for it and let him do orders again. He should have been written to bring the blonde guy with him as proof. Then Spacely would have hired him before he could destroy his machines for being too dangerous. I didn't see the point of the master computer that should have never been built, and its invisible ray would only be abused by people. But at least the magnet ray would be a non-violent way of making dangerous people harmless, which is better for handling criminals and soldiers. It's still too bad he was written to destroy most of his machines, because it made Spacely mad at George for a depressing ending that could have easily not happened. If he thought it was a good idea to make these things in the first place, why did he need George to let him know they were dangerous, when he'd only make them because he'd think that was worth it? It's not really a believable story because of how much George lucked out meeting this guy. But it was good for being interesting the whole time because of the constant gadgets he revealed. But they were hard to take seriously because they always came out of nowhere, for a character that came out of nowhere. The last story is about Spacely promoting George to vice president just to fool his competition who stalks him disguised as a robot to try to find out about his newest product. And they end up thinking the newest product is just the same old gear as before, when the real new product somehow sucks. I can't follow Spacely's plan. Why'd he put an idiot in a high-ranking position? The ending's confusing because right after Spacely regrets promoting George, Cogswell thinks George is a genius who almost put him out of business, even though all that happened to the spies is that they thought Spacely's new product was the same old gear as before, which isn't nearly as bad as if he found out what the new product was and sold it. So Spacely's plan only protected his competitor. George gave him no reason to think he did anything to hurt their business. At least he did keep his job, but I have no reason to think he'll be good at it. This issue is a mixed bag.